Welcome to DriverDTrains. Thanks for stopping by. I'm your host, DriverD. We're joined again today by our conductor and brakeman, Scratchy-C. Recently, I completed a pair of videos showcasing the D-Saver, my 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale switching layout that I built on a shelf so that I could run my HO scale DCC sound-equipped 4-axle GP locomotives and conduct switching operations with modern 50 to 60-foot rolling stock in the small space I had available. These videos complement two of my older videos where I showed how I designed the D-Saver and explained why I built it. In order to assist both new and returning viewers, I have compiled all the videos from the series into this one Supercut so that you can have the complete set all together in one place. The resulting video is a bit long. To assist with navigation through the various parts, I have included a table of contents at the beginning of the video, as well as individual chapter markers in the bottom left corner of the screen. Be sure to check this video's description for links to the original videos in the series, along with links to my video series on assembling a DCC-EX command station, and my series on using JMRI's Decoder Pro app to control our trains, as well as the various websites and products I mention here. Also, if you are enjoying the videos, please leave a comment and hit the like button. And if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to the channel. But the train won't drive itself, so climb on board and let's get rolling. D-Saver 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale switching layout. Here's the manifest for today's video. Part 1. Old is new again. It started with spaceships. Not being able to find timely news and information about rocketry and spaceflight on regular news sites, I turned to YouTube in order to stay up to date.
Wait, is this what I think it is? My name is Felix and I am your host for today's episode of What About It?
Welcome to Starbase Ping. This is your daily space and SpaceX news.
Let's start the updates with Falcon 9 launching from Space Launch Complex 40, carrying Arabsat Badr 8 satellite. This is liftoff.
And liftoff. Go, Falcon.
At some point, the YouTube algorithm decided that I might want to also watch videos about people building Lego spaceships. This led to videos about people building Lego cities and running Lego trains. Shortly after that, I started paying more attention to the model railroading videos the YouTube algorithm was sending my way, and I started thinking about getting some of my old trains out of storage from the closet. And so, after another decade away from the hobby, I was drawn back. My first thought was to try and build a layout running around the perimeter of the bedroom home office up by the ceiling. But I soon realized that the logistics for that would be impractical. And I didn't like to imagine what might happen if one of my trains ever derailed and fell off the track, crashing to the floor or on my head from that height. So I next turned to the idea of building a small shelf layout. Shelf layout is a term that can have several very different meanings in model railroading. In some cases, model railroaders use the term shelf layout to describe a layout built on narrow pieces of benchwork, sometimes with multiple levels or decks, running around the perimeter of a room or along a divider. In my case, I was looking to build a very small layout, about the size of a shelf that you might find in a bookcase or a small closet. It had to be something that I could set up and store away easily, in case someone ever needed to use the bedroom. So I started searching the internet for information about small shelf layouts. and watching YouTube videos on channels that featured small shelf layouts, some of which I shared in my previous video. My initial idea was to build the layout on a 4-foot by 8-inch piece of foam that I would cantilever off the windowsill in the bedroom home office. I would scenic the layout base, paint a backdrop, and run one of my DCC sound locomotives back and forth with a freight car or two. I wasn't looking to build a diorama. My interests and skills are not in diorama making. I wanted something where I could watch the train go back and forth, moving a car or two around for some purpose or other, while making train noises. Then I rediscovered John Allen's Timesaver layout. I had both known about and completely forgotten John Allen's Timesaver for decades. I am pretty certain I first learned about it when I was building my layout in college. 20 years later, I purchased a PDF collection of model railroader articles about it. Trying to figure out how it worked hurt my brain, and eventually I forgot about it. An influential American model railroader from the 1940s and into the post-war era, Allen was a pioneer in many different areas of the hobby. Allen was a professional photographer and contributed both photos and articles to several model railroad magazines for almost 30 years. Probably best known for his cavernous, gory and defeated railroad, the G&D, the story of the Timesaver was the last article of Allen's published in Model Railroader magazine before Allen's sudden passing in 1973. Featured in the November 1972 issue of Model Railroader magazine, the Timesaver is a switching puzzle layout. In a switching puzzle layout, the goal is to figure out how to move all the cars to the correct locations on the track, preferably as efficiently as possible. I like to think of them as the model railroad equivalent of the 15 puzzle. There are a variety of different types, but the two most well known are the Inglenook Sidings shunting puzzle, which reminds me of a ring stacking puzzle, and John Allen's Timesaver. Allen first built the small, portable Timesaver in 1966 to play as a game with friends and take with him to model railroading conventions. The goal is to move all the randomly placed cars to their randomly designated spots as quickly as possible. The speed of the locomotive is fixed. Only the direction can be changed, along with the turnouts that determine the locomotive's path across the layout. Within a few years of creating the Timesaver, there were numerous copies and variations. Thousands of model railroaders have likely tried it since. You can find some of them here on YouTube. As I researched how to design my own shelf layout, I realized that what I wanted, a small layout where I could watch the train go back and forth, moving a car or two around with a purpose, while making train noises, sounded a lot like the Timesaver. I decided that I would build my own version of a small switching puzzle layout, inspired by the Timesaver, with a bit of Inglenook mixed in, but sized and arranged to fit the small space I had in mind. Made with commercially available track and suitable for the modern 50 to 60 foot rolling stock and the 4-axle GP switching locomotives I already owned. The D-Saver was born. Part 2. Designing the D-Saver. In this video, I'll take you through the process and show you how I designed the D-Saver, the small 1-foot by 6-foot switching puzzle layout I built on a shelf. That is my version of John Allen's famous Timesaver layout. In my second video, A Model Railroader's Journey, I explained why I decided to build a small HO scale, shelf-sized switching layout so that I could get my trains out of the closet and back on the track. I knew that I wanted a DCC-powered layout where I could operate the DCC sound locomotives and modern rolling stock I already owned. However, the layout had to be small, compact, and sturdy enough that I could store it away in a closet or stand it in a corner when not in use. One of the first things I had to decide was what kind of track I wanted to use. 15 years ago, when I had set up trains on the floor for my children, I had used Bachmann Easy Track with built-in plastic roadbed because it was easy to set up and take apart, as well as durable and stable on the floor. However, for the D-Saver, I wanted track that was more realistic looking and available in a larger variety of sizes. When I had started a layout in college 35 years ago, I had used Code 100 Atlas SnapTrack and FlexTrack, in part because it was readily available, came in a large variety of shapes and sizes, and worked with all the rolling stock and locomotives. However, in the intervening years, Code 83 Rail, which is more realistic in size, has become more prevalent, and if anything, is available in an even greater variety than the older Code 100. So I knew that I wanted to use Code 83 Rail to build the D-Saver. Based on price, availability, and overall simplicity, I decided to build the D-Saver using Atlas Code 83 SnapTrack, FlexTrack, and turnouts. I also knew that I wanted to plan my layout using layout modeling software. I was intrigued by some of the videos I had seen demonstrating SCARM, the simple computer-aided railway modeler. I was particularly interested in the ability to operate a virtual model of the train on the virtual layout design in the software. However, SCARM is only available for Windows, and I use a Mac. So I next turned to see what options were available for the Mac. I went online and searched for Mac model train layout design software and found Rail Modeler Express available on the App Store. Way back in 2006, I had purchased a license for Rail Modeler Classic direct from the developer, so I thought I would give this new version a try. Rail Modeler is available in two versions, the free Express version and the Pro version. The Express version of Rail Modeler is missing some of the features of the Pro version, and you are limited to how many pieces of track you can use. This is quite similar to some of the other layout design packages available on Windows, such as SCARM, which I already mentioned, as well as AnyRail, which also has a 50-piece track limit for the free version. In my case, I figured that 50 pieces of track would be plenty for the D-Saver, so I installed the free version of Rail Modeler Express and got started designing my layout. Even though I hadn't used Rail Modeler in over 15 years, I found it generally easy to use, although not always intuitive. As with any computer program, it does have a few quirks, and I ran into a few problems, but ultimately it did what I wanted and I was generally happy with the results. The first thing I did when I opened Rail Modeler was to adjust some of the settings. The main screen shows a grid where you can begin laying out your track. From the Rail Modeler menu, I chose Settings and then selected inches for the units of measurement. The grid does not automatically resize when you change the units of measurement, so I had to do that manually by going to the far right side of the screen and selecting the Document sidebar. Then I could change the layout grid to appear every 12 units, which means every 12 scale inches or 1 foot on the diagram. Next, I had to select the track I was going to use. Rail Modeler offers hundreds of libraries for track, vehicles, and accessories from many of the major manufacturers in every scale from Z to G. So I selected HO Scale Atlas Code 83 Track to begin. Once I had those settings changed, I was ready to start laying out the track. As I explained in my previous video, my initial idea was to build the D-Saver on a 4-foot by 8-inch piece of foam that I could cantilever off the windowsill in our second bedroom home office. My thought was that the layout would be suitably out of the way and yet still easily accessible. So the first thing I did in Rail Modeler was to use the Shape tool to draw a rectangle to represent the 4-foot by 8-inch piece of foam for the layout base. Then I added 4 sections of 9-inch straight track, just to see how it fit. Are you reading Model Railroader, Scratchy? Do you see some good articles? That's an old magazine. That's a magazine from when I was a little boy. Watch out for the magazine. I'm going to open the magazine up here. Okay. Now, the D-Saver was inspired in part by John Allen's famous Time Saver, a small switching puzzle layout that has been popular with model railroaders for over 50 years. The heart of the Time Saver, and one of the things that makes it different from some other famous switching puzzle layouts, like the Inglenook siding shunting puzzle, is the Time Saver's use of a runaround track, which is like a very short passing siding. This small section of track allows a locomotive to move from the front to the back of a car it is spotting, or vice versa, and is key to the operation of the layout. So the first thing I did when designing the D-Saver was to figure out how I was going to lay out the runaround. Atlas HO Scale Code 83 track features several different types of turnouts. The most basic is the snap switch, which features a curving 18-inch radius turnout. These types of turnouts have been around forever, and most train sets that come with turnouts, including the ones that I had as a child, come with these types of switches. The problem with a curving turnout is that they lead into a curve, and if your intention is not to curve, but instead to create a parallel track, then you have to add a curve in the opposite direction of the switch to straighten out, which results in an S-curve in the track. Trains hate S-curves, and they cause huge numbers of derailments because the train cars can't follow each other through the bends of the S-curve. So I knew that for the D-Saver, I would not be using snap switch style curved turnouts. Straight turnouts come in a number of different sizes and are numbered based on how sharply the diverging track breaks away from the straight route. The smaller the number, the larger the angle between the two routes of the turnout. Generally speaking, the larger the turnout number, the easier it is for your train to get across, which helps to improve reliability and decreases the odds of a derailment. Atlas HO Scale Code 83 turnouts come in number 4, number 6, and number 8 sizes, so I decided to start with number 6. I laid out a left-hand and a right-hand turnout facing each other and connected them with some straight sections of track. I then looked at how to connect the diverging routes to make the runaround. The diverging route of a number 6 turnout diverges from the straight route at an angle of approximately 9.5 degrees. For the trigonometry nerds, you'll know that that's the inverse tangent of 1 over 6. Atlas does not offer a 9.5 degree curved section of track, but the 1/3 of an 18-inch radius curved piece at 10 degrees is likely close enough. However, Rail Modeler also offers the layout designer the ability to create their own curve from FlexTrack, so I decided to try that. Using a piece of FlexTrack, I selected Rail Modeler's option to bend it to a curved shape, then specified the radius I wanted, 22 inches, and the desired angle, 9.5 degrees. This resulted in a curve for the number 6 turnout that allowed my runaround track to parallel the straight route. I then connected up the sections and decided to see how it would look with a car on the track. Rail Modeler doesn't offer any libraries for locomotives and rolling stock, but there are some generic railcar symbols in a few different lengths. I selected the 8-inch car, which would be 58 feet in HO scale, which sounded just about right for most of the rolling stock that I wanted to run. Once I placed a couple of cars on the track, I realized that I needed a little more space between the main line and the runaround, so I increased the lead between the turnout and the curve from 2 inches to 3 inches. I connected the ends of the facing turnouts with a shortened piece of FlexTrack and placed the entire assembly on the rectangle that represented the layout board. Unfortunately, the runaround made with the number 6 turnouts spanned nearly the entire length of the space I had available, with not even room for a section of track leading into the turnouts. That was not going to work. So I went back to the digital drawing board and tried again using the smaller number 4 turnouts. I used the same process as I had before, tightened the radius of the small curves that connected the turnouts to the runaround to 18 inches, and placed the entire assembly on the layout board. This time I had room for a 9-inch piece of straight track on one end of the runaround. This was a little better, but still not usable. I tried a few other ideas, such as having a few trailing sidings, similar to Inglenook, but then I decided to take one of the turnouts and turn it around to connect its diverging route to the other turnout's diverging route. This had the advantage of creating two parallel tracks in a short space and didn't require a separate curve. I also found that if I added a short 2-inch piece of track between the diverging routes of the two facing turnouts, that the ends of their straight routes aligned, and the space between the tracks was more than sufficient to allow cars to be on the two tracks side by side at the same time. Encouraged by this progress, I made a duplicate copy of my crossover and added it next to the first one, with one section of straight track in between, then finished the assembly with a couple of sections of straight track at the ends. The resulting layout was 6 9-inch sections of track in length, or 54 inches long. This was 6 inches longer than what I had intended, but I was becoming resigned to the fact that 4 feet, or 48 inches, would not be long enough to meet my needs, and an extra 6 inches was not a deal breaker, and was, in fact, a pretty good compromise. The other thing I saw was that this layout was only 4 inches wide, just half the space that I had available. So I looked to see if I could add another siding. The way I chose to do this was to add a turnout on one side between the other two turnouts. I chose the top side of the layout. Also, all the other turnouts on the layout thus far had been right-hand turnouts. For this last siding, I used a left-hand turnout. This means that for a locomotive entering the middle track or main line from the right and traveling towards the left, all of the turnouts will appear as trailing point turnouts. However, a locomotive on the bottom track will see the turnouts as facing points. Even so, the combination of two pairs of connected turnouts in the middle of the layout allows for a runaround track that can hold 2 cars, with 1 car on the diverging route of a turnout, which makes switching operations possible. Meanwhile, a locomotive on the middle track or main line will be able to shuffle 1 car at a time on or off of the upper siding, which will make those operations challenging and hopefully a lot of fun. So I stretched the layout board to 54 inches and placed the track on it, added half a dozen cars, found a symbol for a locomotive, and tried switching the cars around on the screen. I backed a car into the lower trailing spur, repositioned it on the runaround, then got behind it to pull another car out of the lower facing spur, repositioned that car on the main line, then placed the first car into the spur in its place. I then repositioned and ran around the second car on the main line and backed it into position where the first car had been. I then pulled a car off the upper trailing spur, moved 2 cars onto the lower trailing spur, grabbed a second car off the upper trailing spur, and replaced it with 2 others. I continued on in this way, trying several other moves. Satisfied that this layout might work, I moved on to the next step, printing out the layout on paper and trying it with some of my HO rolling stock. I could have simply printed the layout in a single pass on a series of 8.5 by 11 inch sheets of paper, which would have been the simplest thing to do for such a small layout. But instead I decided to print out individual pieces of track, which I then cut out and taped together. I did this because I thought it would be easier to modify the paper track layout if I decided to make any changes. Once I had the paper layout taped together, I laid it out on the floor and placed some of my HO freight cars on it. For the engine, I used a folded paper locomotive I picked up a few months prior from an information booth at a local train show. I then experimented with moving the cars around on the paper track the same way I had done on the computer screen. Happy with the results, it was time to purchase the track and assemble the layout. The small D-Saver layout does not require a lot of sections of track, consisting of just 5 turnouts, 1 small curve, and some straight track. But Rail Modeler does offer the option of listing out all the track and the other parts in your layout, which is very handy for making a shopping list. As soon as I was able, I purchased the track sections I needed, along with an assortment of short, straight pieces I could use to make any necessary adjustments. This was a fortuitous choice, as they would come in handy later. I got all the track laid out and started assembling it on the floor, just as I had with the paper cutouts. I hadn't been able to get the short curved piece I needed for the spur at the top of the layout, so I just ran that spur off at an angle for the time being. I then placed a few freight cars on the track to see how they fit. While everything had seemed okay on the computer and with the paper cutouts, this would be the real test. And for manually uncoupling the cars, I started by using a simple toothpick. The first thing I discovered is that there wasn't enough space between the turnouts along the length of the track for the runaround and the spur at the top, so I ended up adding 3 inches there. Also, the design of the runaround anticipated that a car would be parked on the diverging track of a turnout without impeding traffic on the other connecting turnout and parallel track. But the 2-inch spacer I had used in each pair of facing turnouts was simply not long enough for this. Eventually, after some trial and error, I would end up doubling these spacers to 4 inches, which I did by cutting a 9-inch piece of track in 2 and then cutting off the extra inch. Together, these changes increased the overall length of the layout to about 58 inches, or just under 5 feet. However, a freight car could now park on one turnout without fouling an adjacent turnout, so it looks like this might actually work. The next order of business was to get the layout board to mount the track to. So off to the home improvement store I went. Because the layout was going to be located in the bedroom home office, and I had to be able to store the layout away when not in use, I did not intend to build any kind of benchwork for it. My original intention had been to mount the layout on a 4-foot by 8-inch piece of foam and place it in the window. However, the selection of foam at my local home improvement store was pretty poor. Years ago, I had glued together 3 2-foot by 4-foot foam boards to make the 4-foot by 6-foot layout that now entertains the skeletons in the patio room. However, my local store no longer offers those, instead selling 2-foot by 2-foot project boards. When the layout was only going to be 4 feet long, I figured that I could cut one of these boards in half and place the 2 pieces end to end for a 1-foot by 4-foot long board. However, the layout was now almost 5 feet long, which meant that I would have to cut and glue together 3 narrow pieces, and I wasn't sure how sturdy that would be. I also considered cutting down a full-size 4-foot by 8-foot sheet of foam, but that was much more than I needed, cost nearly $50, and I had no way to transport it without having it cut at the store, which I was reluctant to do without laying out the track on it first. So next I looked at the possibility of using a piece of plywood or other type of lumber for the layout base, but ran into the same issues. Finally, while wandering through the aisles, I stumbled upon the laminated wood shelf boards. These boards are designed to be used with track shelving systems and come in several different lengths and colors. For my D-Saver layout, I would start with a 1-foot by 6-foot board in one of the brown colors. I had some concerns with the shelves. First, they are heavy and tend to sag under their own weight. Second, when I got around to trying to paint or scenic it, I was going to have to get creative and find materials that would stick to it. But most importantly, the shelves are made of particle board with laminated edges, so if I cut it to the 5-foot by 8-inch size I wanted, I would have 2 exposed, jagged edges of particle board, including along the entire length of the shelf. I decided to deal with those problems later and bought one of the lighter ash-colored boards. When I got home, I laid the shelf out on the floor and reassembled the track on it. I replaced all the freight cars and swapped out the paper locomotive for one of my Southern Pacific GP38s, a well-weathered Athearn Genesis model I had previously picked up used on eBay. When my kids were young, we used to watch the remote-controlled Union Pacific GP38s switch one of the local industrial yards. So I wanted to run GP38s, 39s, and 40s on my D-Saver switching layout. Then it was time to try some switching operations by hand one last time. A final check and everything looked good. I no longer had any idea of trying to mount the layout in the window, so I set up a pair of $10 folding TV tray tables I got at Target and placed the layout board on that. Easy, instant bench work. I found the small curved piece of track that I was missing and purchased some Tomar brand track bumpers for the spurs and less obtrusive wheel stops for the central mainline track. I soldered feeder wires to a pair of rail joiners and hooked everything together. I plugged the power lead into my DCC command station, coupled up the cars on the track, and set out the locomotive. For an uncoupling pick, I tried the small plastic KD brand uncoupling tool, but what I found worked best for me are these hard bamboo knitting needles that I found at my local Michael's Craft store. They come in a package of 2 for $6 and are 9 inches long and available in several diameters. I bought the smallest size they had in the store, which are 4 millimeters in diameter, although smaller sizes are available, and they work great as an uncoupler. So now that everything was set up, it was time to fire up the Jeep and run an operating session. The D-Saver was alive! It's alive! Look at it go, Scratchy! Look at it go! Uh-oh. Our conductor, Scratchy-C, is busy inspecting the train. What's that, Scratchy? The layout needs more props? Like a stage set needs props for its actors, a model train layout needs props for its trains. I will eventually paint and ballast the track and add some dirt, weeds, concrete, and asphalt to the layout, as well as maybe a removable structure flat. But for now, I placed a few trucks and shipping containers by the track to add some interest. I also decided to use the entire 1 foot by 6 foot shelf board and not try to cut it smaller, so I had a bit of extra room to work with. I already had some extra track on hand, and this allowed me to add one more facing point spur off the existing spur at the top of the layout. While I plan to eventually add operations on this spur as a kind of bonus level for the switching puzzles, at the moment it is just there to provide visual interest and park a few freight cars. Next, I decided to make a backdrop for the layout. I bought a 3-panel, 36 by 48 inch foam core presentation board, cut off the wing panels, and taped them end to end. I stitched together and printed out a photo of a warehouse on several sheets of paper and taped them to the foam panels. I set this behind the layout, but it tends to fall onto the track and otherwise get in the way, so I'll revisit that idea at a later date. Finally, the last thing I added was some light for the layout. I bought the cheapest single-tube 3-foot LED shop light I could find at my local home improvement store and suspended it from a pair of coat hangers hooked onto the doors of a cabinet. It's not pretty, but it works and gets the job done, so I can see the couplers down between the freight cars. And that's how I designed and built the D-Saver. The layout is far from complete. In fact, it's barely even started. Before I paint and ballast the track, I'll be replacing some of the shorter pieces of snap track with flex track to reduce the number of rail joints. I also need to add additional feeder wires to the layout for improved electrical reliability. Then I'll be able to start the scenic process in earnest. But even so, the layout is complete enough that I can run trains and conduct operating sessions, and has provided countless hours of enjoyment so far. Part 3. Meet the D-Saver, 1 foot by 6 foot HO scale switching layout. Here are all the loads and empties we'll be wheeling today. First, we'll look again at the design of the D-Saver layout. Then we'll look at how operations on the D-Saver work and some of the features of the layout. After that, we'll look at the D-Saver switching puzzle app and how I use that to create and keep track of all the switch lists for the operating sessions. Finally, we'll conduct a switching session on the D-Saver to see firsthand how it works. We're clear on the main, so notch up the throttle on this old hog and let's walk the dog. Meet the D-Saver, 1 foot by 6 foot HO scale switching layout. Part 1. The D-Saver layout. As I described in my first 2 videos, I designed the D-Saver layout so I could run my HO scale DCC sound-equipped 4-axle GP locomotives and conduct switching operations with modern 50 to 60 foot rolling stock in the small space I had available. In my 3rd video, I walked viewers step by step through how I created the D-Saver and explained my thought process and all the decisions I made on how to design and build the layout. For an HO scale layout, the D-Saver is tiny. While my own D-Saver layout is built on a 1 foot by 6 foot shelf board, the track plan itself is only 8 inches by 54 inches in size. This is actually 6 inches longer than the original 4 foot or 48 inch length I had in mind when I started. There has been a lot of interest lately in very small layouts. Ironically, on the day I sat down to start this video, my October 2024 issue of Model Railroader magazine arrived. Starting on page 51 in this issue, there is a feature by Thomas Klimovsky featuring 2 possible HO scale track plans for the Florida East Coast Railroad's Pompano Market branch line. One of the HO scale track plans is designed for a spare bedroom, but the other is designed for an 18 inch by 6 foot 8 inch hollow core door. The track plan for this smaller layout is nearly identical to the D-Saver, with just a slightly different runaround and using number 6 turnouts versus the number 4 I used on the D-Saver. Perhaps self-conscious about the small size of the layout, the author felt compelled to suggest adding an optional 2 foot staging cassette to the end of the layout to really help with switching operations. Describing the small track plan, the author says, "This layout will allow you to build your skills of track laying, wiring, structure building, and operations. It's a great layout for a beginner or someone with very little space for a layout." Well, I can attest to the last part of that sentence anyway. My 1 foot by 6 foot D-Saver actually impedes my workspace, which I need for my job, and blocks part of my desk. So I end up moving the layout on a daily basis. And a staging cassette would eliminate much of the challenge I designed the D-Saver to provide. Along with my subscription, Model Railroader also recently sent me a 47-page compilation of 14 skill-building model railroad projects. The first project featured is an 8 inch by 6 foot HO scale shelf layout from Lance Mintime. Lance is a well-known and respected model railroader who has written numerous books on various model railroading topics, contributed to several model railroading publications, including Model Railroader, and has a popular YouTube channel as well as his own website. In his piece for Model Railroader, Lance suggests that modelers who don't have space to build a layout can nevertheless hone their skills by working on a small shelf layout which can fit virtually anywhere and can even be stored upright in a closet. That is exactly the situation I was in when I designed the D-Saver. But I had to chuckle when I read the list of skills that Lance suggests we'll need to develop. Forgive me if I sound like a broken record, but they include laying cork roadbed, laying, painting, and ballasting track, wiring, setting up a control system, basic scenery skills, and structure building skills. For those who are counting, that's 2 separate articles that have told me that beginning model railroaders need to develop skills in track laying, structure building, and scenery making. What kind of gatekeeping is that? While those are certainly valuable skills for model railroading, what about developing skills like building your own command station, learning how to install and configure DCC decoders, experimenting with different types of throttles to control your trains, automating train movements, or practicing prototypical switching operations. There's no reason that a so-called beginning model railroader can't choose to start with these skills and move on to other things like ballasting track, structure building, and scenery making later. Learning how to assemble and configure a command station such as DCC-EX, program DCC decoders with software such as JMRI, control trains with different types of throttles such as the Y throttle and engine driver apps, automate train movements with EX Rail, and perform prototypical switching operations are all skills that a model railroader of any experience can practice and develop on a small shelf layout like the D-Saver. Part 2. Operations on the D-Saver. As I have mentioned in prior videos, the D-Saver is a switching puzzle layout. It is my version of John Allen's famous time saver layout, which has been around for over 50 years, with a bit of Inglenook Siding's shunting puzzle mixed in, but sized and arranged to fit my small space, made with commercially available track, and suitable for modern HO scale 50 to 60 foot rolling stock and 4-axle GP switching locomotives. Although the D-Saver is a switching puzzle layout, it is meant to be operated in a somewhat prototypical fashion, using 1 locomotive and 6 freight cars. Unlike the time saver, where the goal is to complete the puzzle as quickly as possible, on the D-Saver there is no timer, and the slower we go and the more time we take, the better. I typically spend about 30 to 40 minutes on each operating session, and could easily spend twice that much if I stopped to line each turnout and manually set the brakes on each car I pick up or set out. And while we might generally aim to complete our switching activities as efficiently as possible, we do not count car moves, how many times we change directions, or anything else for that matter. On the D-Saver, the puzzle we are trying to solve is just to get all 6 cars placed into their correct spots. That might sound simple, but because the D-Saver is so small, it is actually quite challenging. Understanding operations on the D-Saver begins with the location of the layout. The D-Saver is located along a fictional branch line or industrial lead serving a number of different industries. The D-Saver itself serves one of these industries, which spans both sides of the tracks and receives many different types of freight cars. I like to imagine the setting as being on the fringes of an urban area, but it could just as easily be a rural one. And since I like to run locomotives with a number of different road names, we'll also just imagine that a number of different railroads serve the industries along this line. While fictional, this arrangement is inspired by prototypical conditions in my area, where Union Pacific and BNSF share trackage through town, and I frequently see foreign power on the main line and branch leads. The main line down the middle of the D-Saver represents a segment of the larger branch line industrial lead. Short spurs on sidings above and below the main line provide 5 spotting locations to set out and pick up freight cars from the local industry. During each operating session, a locomotive enters from the right with from 1 to 4 freight cars, sets out some of the cars, moves some of the cars at the industry from one spot to another, and picks up some of the cars from the industry before leaving the layout to the left with its train. The upper spur on the right side of the layout has spots for 2 cars. I model this location as being a warehouse, which I printed on the photo backdrop. The spur on the bottom left side of the layout also has spots for 2 cars. I model this as a multi-purpose freight yard, which is located below the spur just off the layout. Finally, the spur at the bottom right side of the layout has a spot for 1 car. This spur can be used as either a team track or a temporary storage location for a car waiting to move to another spot on the layout or leave the layout on a later train. The track on the bottom siding between the 2 spurs is not a spotting location, but rather part of the runaround track. On my as-built layout, I have also included a spur at the upper left side of the layout, but as I described in my video number 3, This is not actually part of the D-Saver, but rather just a storage location for a few cars that I added to the layout for visual interest. Maybe someday it will become part of the D-Saver Plus. For now, however, we are going to ignore it for the rest of this video, and I will not include it on any of the track diagrams. As I mentioned a moment ago, in addition to the 5 industry spotting locations, the locomotive can enter the layout from the right with from 1 to 4 freight cars. These cars are meant to represent the first few cars in a much longer train of cars bound for other industries somewhere down the line. I like to represent this imaginary train of cars with a boxcar fitted with a flashing rear end device, which I park on an extra piece of track just off the right side of the layout proper. So if you see a yellow rail box at the end of the train in my layout videos, that is just selective compression at work. One notable consequence of this is that for the purposes of our operating sessions on the D-Saver, the locomotive cannot back its train off the layout. Not because there is no add-on cassette of track for it to do so, but because it would not be practical for the conductor to walk all the way to the back of the train in this instance, or possibly because the train would foul a crossing if it were to do so. So the limitations of the space we have available to model in become a prototypical feature of our layout and add to the challenge of our operating sessions. At the other end of the main line, just off the left side of the layout, there is a grade crossing with some construction going on. To minimize interfering with the maintenance of way crew and unnecessarily blocking traffic, the locomotive cannot leave the layout to the left and proceed through the grade crossing until it has reassembled its entire train and is ready to move on down the line to its next set of deliveries. Therefore, all the switching on the D-Saver has to be done within the confines of the layout. Between the 5 industry car spotting locations, the 4 possible inbound car locations, and a location for the locomotive, there are 10 possible car and locomotive destinations accounted for on the layout. In addition, for switching purposes, there is 1 additional car spot on the upper spur, 1 additional car spot on the left side of the main line, and 3 car spots in the middle of the lower siding. Again, this arrangement has some notable consequences for how we conduct our switching operations. For example, because there are only 2 car spots to the left of the turnout for the upper siding, the locomotive can only move 1 car at a time on or off of the upper spur. And the locomotive cannot move any cars on or off of the lower siding from the left side of the main line, although it can shove 1 car from the runaround track up onto the main line. A car in the lower right-hand spur will severely limit the locomotive's ability to use the runaround track. Also, if there are more than 2 cars on the main line, they will block at least 1 of the turnouts, if not more. The list goes on. A locomotive with more than 2 cars on the main line will not be able to back a car onto the lower right-hand spur. A locomotive on the bottom siding pulling cars off the lower left-hand spur can pull both cars at once by itself, but can only pull 1 car at a time if it is using another car as a handle. Another important thing to note, a turnout cannot be thrown while there is a car on the track the turnout is a part of, even if the car is not technically fouling the points. The car needs to be moved to a clear track before the turnout can be thrown. It is important to realize that these limits are an intentional feature of the D-Saver, designed to make the switching operations a challenge. We could easily add a few inches of track here or there to get around many of these limitations, but that would defeat the purpose of the D-Saver layout, which is to provide a stimulating puzzle to solve while offering the opportunity to conduct lots of prototypically low-speed switching operations, making good use of the runaround track while manually controlling our turnouts and coupling and uncoupling cars. Although there are a total of 15 possible car spots on the layout and 9 car spotting destinations, I had always intended for the D-Saver to be a 6-car switching puzzle. In other words, each switching session always involves 1 locomotive and 6 freight cars. I am pretty sure the D-Saver could be operated with 7 cars, and it can certainly be operated with fewer than 6 cars, but I find that 6 seems to be just the right number for the amount of time and effort required to complete an operating session. What this means is that if there are 4 freight cars set out at industry spots at the beginning of an operating session, the inbound locomotive will bring 2 more cars onto the layout. Conversely, if there are only 2 cars set out at the start, the locomotive will bring in 4 cars. The same arrangement is true for when a locomotive leaves the layout. The number of cars set out at industry plus the number behind the locomotive always adds up to 6. Because there are only 5 industry car spots on the layout, the locomotive will always have at least one freight car in its train. And because the D-Saver main line only has 6 car locomotive spots total, and there needs to be at least one empty spot for the locomotive to be able to move into to clear a switch, the maximum number of freight cars the locomotive can enter or leave the layout with is 4. Therefore, there will always be at least 2 cars spotted on the layout at the beginning or end of each session. This covers all the parameters, I hesitate to call them rules, of the D-Saver. To begin our first switching session, each of the 6 cars is randomly assigned to one of the 9 possible car destinations, which include the 5 at the industry and the 4 in the train. We then place one of our locomotives in the 10th spot and back it up as needed to make a train with the cars that were randomly placed behind it. We then repeat this process to determine where each car needs to be at the end of the switching session. With all our starting and ending locations set, we begin our switching operations. We may find that some of the cars set out at industry need to be moved to other spots at the industry, perhaps to facilitate their loading or unloading, or to make way for another car. Sometimes a car will move from the industry to the temporary storage team track, or vice versa. Sometimes cars in the train behind the locomotive will need to be placed in a different order to facilitate their delivery to another location further down the branch line. And sometimes we may need to relocate a car that was improperly spotted by the previous crew. In any case, once we have completed all our switching, we reassemble our train and proceed off the layout. We can model this on the D-Saver by pulling our train all the way to the left end of the layout and blowing the grade crossing signal on the horn. Our first operating session is now complete. We can remove the locomotive and its train from the layout and start the next session. We can either start over from the beginning and remove all the cars from the industry spotting locations and randomly assign them again, or else use the ending state from the previous switching session as a starting point for the next one, which is what I prefer. For variety, we can replace the locomotive and cars that went off the layout at the end of the last session with a new locomotive and cars, which we place on the inbound track on the right side of the main line. We then repeat the process of randomly determining where each car needs to be at the end of the round of switching. With that, we're ready to start the next switching operating session. And so the process continues, with one session feeding into the next. While it may sound simple, each session is unique and offers its own set of challenges. I have now completed over 100 such sessions and continue to enjoy them as much as when I started a year and a half ago. As I said before, I typically spend about 30 to 40 minutes on each operating session and could easily spend more. We have now looked at the D-Saver layout and examined how the switching sessions work. But there is one more part of the D-Saver we need to explore, and that is the D-Saver Switching Puzzle app that I use to create and keep track of the switch lists for all the operating sessions conducted on the D-Saver. We'll do that next. Part 3. The D-Saver Switching Puzzle app. As I mentioned before, the D-Saver was inspired in large part by John Allen's Time Saver. While I have seen copies of the Time Saver in use, I have never had the opportunity to actually operate one myself. However, I have tried the app version of the Time Saver, available for the iPhone and iPad. One of the features of the app version of the Time Saver is that each of the freight cars is a different color, and the color of the car matches the color of the industry destination for that car. So for example, the blue freight car needs to be spotted at the blue industry, and the green car at the green industry, and so on. While searching on YouTube for examples of the Time Saver and other small switching layouts, I came across a video from Steve of Steve's Trains. In the video, Steve explained how he built an HO scale switching layout for his garage based on the Inglenook Sidings shunting puzzle. But what really struck me about Steve's layout was the way he designed car cards featuring pictures of each freight car that he could then place on the layout to indicate where each car needed to go. I realized immediately that I wanted to do the same thing for the D-Saver, except that instead of printing and laminating pictures of my freight cars on paper, I wanted to display them on my computer. Taking ideas from both the iOS TimeSaver app and Steve's laminated car cards, I set about creating the D-Saver switching puzzle app. I actually started creating the D-Saver app before I had even assembled the layout. At first, I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted the app to do. I thought that I might want the app to be playable, like the iOS TimeSaver app. My earliest version only used different colors to represent different cars. But after I saw Steve's video, I decided to incorporate pictures of my freight cars into the app and redesigned it accordingly. However, I kept the color concept from the iOS app as well and made each of the 6 freight cars a different color to make it visually easier to see where each one needed to go. I also wasn't sure at first what the goal of the D-Saver switching puzzle would be. Would it involve switching all 6 cars on the layout to their proper spots, or just a few? But once I realized that I could, in fact, switch all 6 cars to any spot on the layout as part of the puzzle, it became clear that what I needed was an app to generate the random starting and ending positions for each car. I decided to create this app in Microsoft Excel because I use it all the time for work, and I was confident that I could get it to do what I wanted fairly quickly. Ultimately, I plan to port the D-Saver to being a web app. But for now, Excel it is. After doodling with some formulas, importing a copy of the D-Saver's track plan, adding pictures of my rolling stock, and setting up a random number generator, I soon had a list of switching sessions indicating the starting and ending positions for each car. 2 color-coded track diagrams showed the starting and ending positions for each of the 6 cars based on their color. With this information, I could begin running some trains. At first, I only programmed 1 locomotive and 1 car of each color into the app, so all the switching sessions used the same locomotive and same 6 cars. However, I knew that eventually I would want to change this. I quickly made some updates to the organization of the app. I started setting up a page where I could eventually add more cars and locomotives to my roster, and set up another page to keep track of all the switching sessions. I started experimenting with different ways to display the car locations graphically on the screen. Within a week, I had a well-organized app with a page for my rolling stock, a page for the random number generator for the puzzles, a page listing all the switching sessions by date, and a page for the track plan showing the starting and ending locations of each car for any of the stored switching sessions, which could be selected from a drop-down menu. I even added a background image to the main page. To add some variety to my operating sessions, I would often use a different locomotive or freight cars than what were shown on the app. But after 2 months, I decided it was time to actually add some more locomotives to the app so that it could decide which one I should run on each session. Then I reconfigured the app to add more rolling stock to the roster and reprogrammed it to randomly select which cars to use for each operating session. However, I kept it so that each switching session still features 1 car of each color: red, yellow, green, blue, brown, and black or white. Finally, to make things more prototypical, I adjusted the car selection algorithm to only replace the cars that went off the layout with the locomotive in the previous session, while leaving the cars located at the industry spurs in their car spots. And this is what the D-Saver looks like today. It has a selection of locomotives and rolling stock to choose from. The consist generator analyzes the previous session's outbound freight to randomly generate a new inbound train, then randomly determines all the switching moves to generate a new outbound train. Each new switching session is then copied to the historical list of operating sessions, which can be selected on the main page of the puzzle app from the drop-down menu. The track plans then update to show the current locomotive and the starting and ending positions of each car, while the train shown at the top updates to show all the cars and the locomotive on the layout. And with that information in hand, we are ready to start switching our train and setting out cars. Part 4. A switching session on the D-Saver. Now that we've looked at the D-Saver layout, learned about its operation, and seen how the D-Saver app works, let's start switching some cars. For today's freight, we're running Union Pacific 643, a GP 38-2 that UP inherited when it purchased the Missouri Pacific in 1982. But we've got no time for history lessons, so grab that switch list and let's get started. We've already pulled our locomotive in from the right-hand side of the layout, and now we're looking at red signals both ahead and behind. I'm just glad we cleared that crossing back there and didn't have to brake the train. That would have added the better part of an hour to our troubles today. We're inbound with 2 covered hoppers, but according to the switch list, we're only setting out the second one, a blue ADM 4-bay grain car. I have no idea why it's here. Maybe someone is setting up a microbrewery. But we're supposed to deliver it to warehouse door number 1. It looks like we'll be taking the orange Denver and Rio Grande 3-bay with us to the next stop. At least, I think it's orange under all that dust. Before we can do that, however, we need to relocate that rusty, beat-up old boxcar to the staging spot on the team track. According to this paperwork, there should be Frisco lettering under all that grime. I'm also seeing that we need to collect the yellow Thrall boxcar from the other warehouse door. Hey, you ever see one of those Thralls without its doors? It ain't pretty. We also need to collect the green Burlington Northern covered hopper from one of the spots in the freight yard. And we're going to need to sort those outbound cars into the proper order too, if we're going to make the rest of our deliveries down the line and get home before Christmas. While this all sounds straightforward, the actual sequence of moves we will need to make is quite different and not straightforward at all. We better get started. First, we need to swap the order of the 2 hoppers on the inbound train. Then we can pull both cars at the warehouse off the upper spur and spot them in front of our train. Just remember, Greenhorn, we can only pull them 1 car at a time. Now, let's place the blue ADM, the yellow Thrall, and the orange DRG on the upper spur. Slow down, Hotfoot. Remember, we can only move 1 car at a time onto that spur. Okay, let's slide down onto the lower siding. We can finally pull that green BN out of the spur at the freight yard and shove it up onto the main line. Now we get to play Ring Around the Rosie with that BN. Check your pocket for posies and make sure you don't fall down. We need to circle the runaround, couple onto the green BN, and pull the car past the turnout to the lower siding so we can run around to the other side. Then we'll use the BN as a handle to grab the Frisco boxcar and back that economy sleeper into its spot on the lower spur for the storage team track. Now we can pull the orange DRG hopper and the yellow Thrall boxcar off the upper siding. Make sure we spot that blue ADM at the correct warehouse door, or we'll never hear the end of it from the industry man. It looks like all our packages are finally in order. Let's tie them on, buckle the rubbers, and puff up the pipe. Now the only thing left to do is wait to get our clearance from the dip scratcher. Good job, Roughneck. We've made all our drops and the muckers have cleared the track. We've got the green eye, so sound the horn and let's roll on out. In a few days, a new train will arrive with an entirely new switch list, but that will be some other grunt's problem. Part 4. Switching operations on a 1-foot by 6-foot HO scale layout. Now that we've looked at the D-Saver layout, learned about its operation, seen how the D-Saver switching puzzle app works, and tried a practice run, let's do a full operating session on the layout. I heard they sent a rookie to make the last run. I hope they didn't leave us with too big a mess to clean up. We've just pulled in on the main line in Southern Pacific 7623, a GP 40-2 with speed lettering, along with 3 boxcars at the front of our train. We'll be setting out one, a green Burlington Northern, at the first warehouse door. We'll be picking up a brown Herzog gondola from the freight yard track, and that dirty Frisco boxcar from the team track. We also need to relocate the blue ADM hopper from the warehouse to the freight yard to make room for the green BN we are dropping off. And finally, we need to put our train in order for our next stop. Sounds easy, right? Not a chance, Greenhorn. But let's get started. We'll work the upper warehouse siding first, but we need to get that blue ADM hopper out of the way, so we'll have to make some elbow room before we do anything else. We can start by sliding that dirty Frisco boxcar off the team track and onto the runaround. There. That should keep it out of the way for a bit. Now we can start shuffling our deck of cars. We don't want any jokers in this deck, so we'll need to pay attention to the order we place them in now so that they will all be in the proper order when we're done. We'll want to feed the green BN boxcar onto the upper siding first, followed by the red Santa Fe. So we'll load those two onto the lower spur in reverse order. Remember, we can only shove one car at a time onto that upper siding. So we'll use the yellow rail box as a handle, first for the red Santa Fe, and then for the green BN. All right, we played our first car from the deck. Now for the green BN. Great. Now let's ditch the rail box and go grab that blue ADM hopper. Once we have a place to park the blue ADM hopper, we can load the upper siding with cars and clear the main. So we'll put the rail box back where it started, then back into the upper spur to grab the blue ADM. Got it. Now we'll pull it off the spur and back it up on the main to the rail box we just got rid of. Be sure to shove those side door Pullmans back so we clear the switch. Okay, now let's start feeding the upper spur. Green BN first. Let's bring the Santa Fe along part way to save some time. Why are you working so hard trying to get it just right? We're going to have to move it in a few minutes anyway. Okay, let's go back for the red Santa Fe. Easy, Hotfoot. Okay, back it in. Just leave it here by the switch. Now, we'll want to grab the yellow rail box, but it's behind the blue ADM hopper. Tell you what, let's shove that dirty Frisco boxcar back onto the team track, then spot the blue ADM in front of it on the switch. That way we can grab the rail box and be in position for our next move. Take the runaround and back up to that rust pile. All right, shove it back there. Great. It didn't crumble under its own weight. Now we'll use the runaround to get back on the main and go grab that hopper. Now we'll clear it off the main. Again, we can bring a boxcar partway along for the ride. We'll just leave it here before we foul the switch. Now we can park that hopper on the switch in front of that dirty Frisco boxcar. Now we can shuffle that yellow rail box onto the upper spur with the red Santa Fe and the green BN, and the main will be clear. I've been working on the railroad all the livelong day. Okay, enough musical review. Back that economy sleeper up to its mates and clear the switch. We'll have to reposition that green BN back at the warehouse door again later. Now we'll use the blue ADM as a handle to pull that Frisco boxcar off the team track and couple it up to the rest of our train parked on the main just east of the industry. I think there are a couple dozen more cars hanging out back there if you just squint. Hey, we've got another car properly spotted in the train. Good job, Roughneck. Next, we'll slide that blue ADM hopper onto the lower siding and pull it onto the runaround so we can shove it onto the freight yard track. This never gets old, does it? Whoa there, watch the bumper. Okay, once more onto the runaround. I've been working on the railroad just to pass the time away. What was I saying? Okay, park the blue ADM on the runaround and we'll circle up and couple on behind. Then we'll shove it onto the freight yard spur on the west end of the industry. Again, we'll use it as a handle, this time to grab the brown Herzog gondola. We'll shove that gondola onto the main and then put the hopper in its place on the freight yard track. That's another car put to bed. So easy, a trained monkey could do it. You want a banana? Okay, now we do the runaround again, this time with the brown Herzog gondola, which we will couple up to the train in front of the Frisco boxcar. Back across the lower siding, take the runaround and grab that gon. Pull it down the main until we clear the switch. Then it's back around the runaround and back up to the gon. Gently now, hotshot. Couple it up to the Frisco. There's another car done. Now we just need to pull the red and yellow boxcars off the upper siding and make sure the green BN is parked in the correct spot. You know the drill. One at a time. But first, we'll grab the lot and spot that green BN back at the loading bay. That's 4 down. Next, we'll uncouple from the BN and spot the red Santa Fe by the switch. Okay, time to deal the yellow rail box from our hand. Easy there. 5 cars down, full house. Oh, but not quite. One more to go. Hey, slow down, Glory Hunter. We don't need any busted knuckles. All right, that's the last one. We'll make sure everything is coupled up properly, connect the airlines, and charge up the brake pipe. Once we get the clear signal, we can sound the horn and roll on out. All aboard! What's next? Creating automations in DCC-EX EX Rail. Well, we've seen the D-Saver for real this time. That was about a 30-minute run. Each run on the D-Saver is different. I've done this over 100 times and it never gets old. It looks like UP will be making the next run, bringing in 4 cars, setting out 3, and taking the blue ADM hopper with it. Looks like that green BN we spent so much time spotting at the warehouse needs to be moved to the freight yard. But save all that for another day. In my next series of videos, we'll look at how to set up some automations in DCC-EX EX Rail to help us run our trains. We'll start with the example I use to drive the train off the layout each time I complete an operating session on the D-Saver. Then we'll look at a more complex example of an automation that uses 2 locomotives working together to switch freight cars from one track to another. After that, we'll learn how to add a second LCD and an OLED display to our DCC-EX command station. But there's more freight to move, so that will have to wait for another day. Until then, thanks for watching. Well, Scratchy, are you ready to deliver some freight? All right then, let's do it. All aboard!